Alright, what do, folk? I'm not trying to tarry whatsoever here. But unfortunately, not many of these thoughts are that organized. And so I do apologize for that. In the future, I'm going to have more know how of computer technology and more time to organize my thoughts. And also, I'll have my point across, and other people too, if they are on the same page, can help with that. And then once the bigger picture is clear, I can take the time to open up verse by verse what I think a lot of it means. So, with no further ado, let's get it. Let me turn on my background music. Excuse me. Alright, so in my last video, I was saying how I'd say clearly if you say you be judged by Moses, then you be judged by Moses. But the thing is, it was because they was under the law. So Matthew 23 began with, do whatever they bid you to do, being experts in the law. But the thing is, of all the people that were said to be burned by fire happened to be Semitic people. And so the meaning of that is under the covenant of Abraham, the promise was also to Esau. And the thing is, though, that they was all under his household, and we get into the Ezekiel 30s, the 33, 32, and all that, and around there, and maybe late 20s, that you have these other people that were in Abraham's household that were part of the promise. And, when they got their inheritance and Joshua said that they have it, they never had these portions that belonged to, the other members of the household. And when you get into the sheep and the sheep and the sheep and the rams, not the sheep and the rams, but the sheep and the goats, what you have is a situation where Esau had come under Israel, Judah specifically, and the days before Christ, 150 years prior. And so, for that reason, especially during the Maccabees and what have you, you have, like in the days of David, so, you can't say that the Old Testament is somehow wholly different, or that somehow my argument comes from the intertestamental period and therefore I can't validate it. I mean, we can go up to Samuel and all of that and get it, but I've done a lot of this about the Kenizzites and all kinds of stuff in the past, and Caleb and all kinds of things like that. I mean, you can go to my videos about a few months ago. So, Goliath is the outside, the foreigner, because that's what his name literally means in the Hebrew. And they were supposed to be the smallest people, the last chosen. David was supposed to be the last one, and, they took on these many great giant nations to prove the faithfulness of their God or whatever. And the thing is that these other people, they wanted to say we're under the covenant and we're under the promise, is what they wanted to say. Well, if they're not under the covenant, then how are they going to be burned by the fire of judgment? So this is what John came saying in, Matthew, what was it, chapter 3, that you have to repent because they were not following the law. Because Jesus said, do as they tell you to do, but don't do as they do. And so, because they weren't following the law, it's hard for a lot of people to understand, because they would think that they was following the law. Because they don't realize that they were worshiping Mammon. And this is a clear violation of Ezekiel. And so, and also they were making a lot of the law and the Sabbath a burden, which was contrary to the point. And so, when Esau becomes part of the nation, you have this problem. And you can go into my videos about, actually I deleted the one about Drusilla, but all you need to do is compare Drusilla to Timothy, and you see this identity from both sides of the family, and whether it's father or mother. But regardless, all you got to do is do a little thought experiment where if Esau was inherited by Judah, let's say all the females were left, the ones that had not known a man, and there was no male seed, as it says, then in Maccabees and Samuel and Kings and everything else, you have this situation where, let's say you have this couple, a mother from Esau and a father from, let's say, Judah. They have a daughter, and so this daughter would be raised Jewish. So then you have this thing where they want to say that the mother's lineage is what determines who you are. Well, Esau happens to be the mother's lineage. And so you have the same situation with the tribe of Benjamin, who weren't allowed to marry within the tribes. And, they all took wives from the dancing girls or whatever. And you can see that at the end of the book of Judges. And so, what I wanted to say was that they was all supposed to be corrupted in body, including David. David married a mother and daughter, both, which was against the law. He did all kinds of things that was against the law. And for that reason, his body saw corruption, as Peter pointed out, and from the protocol. And that because Christ's body did not see corruption, he was perfect before the law, and he was born under the law, but he was punished under the law. And they are the ones saying that if you broke the law, you get punished. But he didn't break the law. So their bodies would all see corruption. They would see the judgment. They were the ones that said, if you violate the law, you will be judged. If you break even one law, as it says in Ezekiel 33 and Deuteronomy and, 1, 2, and 3. So the judgment for killing the prophets, as well as, and the prophets even of the new, that's why John the Baptist and his father Zechariah are such important figures, for the same reason, to say that they were judged under the law, because they were saying to repent, and so they would devour widows' houses, for instance, and a widow is under the protections of true religion, as James would call it, and as I think others I've done in prior videos in the Old Testament have done the same. And so they would be blamed. But Jesus' home base wasn't even Jerusalem. He went and cleansed out Jerusalem with the zeal, because being a descendant of David or whatever. But his home base, where he was accepted, was on the anti-mountain, the one directly to the east of it. And we know from Ezekiel that God's presence went to the east, and we know from Second Kings that that same mountain was across the valley to be directly adjacent, and Solomon had built his shrine there. Jesus, and Solomon shared the wisdom kind of thing. But, and some say that Solomon's wisdom, a lot of it comes from, the Greeks, but I'm not going to get into that because that would be problematic for a lot of people because it would belie the dating of a lot of things and give it a late date. So I don't want to offend nobody. Paul was really good about that. Paul would go to great lengths to make sure that nobody was offended because of their preconceived notions and everything. But the reason why Jesus can, save them from this fire for breaking the law and putting him to death was through the Old Testament, the very Old Testament, the Torah, the very beginning. And I think that the inclusion of Torah, even though the Yehudi people weren't the first to have it, that Israel had it first, that then for that reason, the reason why they put it in there and harp on it so much is because that is older, and that points to, like as First Corinthians 10 says, this is given to them for instruction to point to what they came from. But it doesn't seem very good because all these animals that were taken into the wilderness, to let the beast gods have, was not really fair to these animals, and for that reason, this goat was greater than the people because, or the sacrifice even, another part of Leviticus 16, that was perfect and blameless, and so that's why that was greater than them, but that didn't give them morality. The only morality come from repenting and not continuing to sin. And so the whole history becomes something they didn't even do. They say they're in diaspora and can't perform the law without the priesthood and the temple and everything. So it's history to them too. So it just points to a prior time for what it can mean to people. Well, for the Christian, it means that they don't have to sacrifice, and they're not looking for some sacrifice in the future. And as Hebrews 10 says, you wouldn't want to anyways because of Christ. And so the Christian can look back to the Torah and say that the sacrifices pointed to something much greater, and it's not to do the sacrifices. And this greater thing, like that, it wasn't to do this even then. It was to have the people who would receive the Messiah to accept him and to follow him, but they did not realize the time of their visitation, and they chose a murderer over him and put him to death. And you can go to the days of Alexander Jannaeus. I know this doesn't sound like a very Yehudi name, Alexander Jannaeus or whatever, but he was the Maccabean leader, and he crucified lots of people, and said they were guilty under the law. But the thing is, they wasn't guilty under the law any more than the leaders were. The leaders, with their white tunics and their purple fringes or whatever, scarlet fringes, they was living high off the hog, and really getting pretty gross, you know. So I wanted to point to a lot of things in John 12 and uh, Isaiah 51 and Isaiah 52, but I want to organize those thoughts better. So I'm just going to point to a couple things and then move it on and then back it up. So like in my last video, I wanted to point out again, if I'm lifted up to the earth, I will draw all people to myself. And then the note there says his glorification is the cross, which was really interesting. But it says, verse 25, he who loves his life will lose it, and he who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. And I want to give a big shout out to William Bell, because he's tackled this in how it relates to Matthew 16:25, where Jesus had talked about whoever desires to save his life, will lose it. And that a seed must die, for it to yield much fruit. And the increase comes from, as Mark 4:19 says, or I can't remember where, but, the farmer goes to sleep, and, the God giveth the increase, as Paul would say. And, but this isn't true for all of them. Most of them, it would be true that they would be dead and, see corruption, and then be given the resurrection, they would meet him in the air. But there would be some, like John the Beloved, who by the year 70 AD hadn't even died yet, and that he would be transformed in the twinkling of an eye when Jesus would come in his glory, which was 70 AD. And this isn't that all his eyes would see, as Don Preston says, a 5'5" dude in the clouds, literally as they've seen him before. This would be when they see him in their mind's eye, as I would say. That in their mind's eye, they view him that way. And how do they view him that way? Did I save it? It's like you will when you see like when you see his coming, it will be I can't even put words on this. Like with the angels, you will see the angels. Now, as John said, the ascending and descending on him, of course, but there was something else like that at the right hand of God, and you would see the Son of Man in his glory and stuff like that. But the thing is that you got to understand in Luke 24 how they talked about before they realized they were speaking to Christ himself, that they had thought him to be a great prophet and that he died, and that it was almost like they felt the loss that the kingdom wasn't. So so it always was prophesied by Christ that you will see his kingdom coming in his kingdom. But that would be, in my understanding, as Stephen saw him, as Paul was trying to open up to make him that light, that here's this man that came to earth and dwelt amongst in fleshly body. And that most of them didn't understand in their brains how that could be God. Even though it always said through the past that God himself would redeem them. So the Redeemer that God saves comes to earth and does it as they had always prophesied, and they miss it. They don't see it because they see him as a man. And the reason they saw him as a man is because he died before his kingdom came. Well, because of that disbelief, his kingdom coming didn't include them unless they had the Son. It was always required to have the Son. And to see the Son of Man in his glory was to realize in your mind that he is Christ, the Messiah, God himself coming down to save humanity, that had always been promised through the sacrifice, through the Torah, through everything they had said, and they miss it. It doesn't become clear to them. Even his own apostles fell asleep. They weren't there for him. They abandoned him. And so nobody realized it. Maybe one woman who mistook him for a gardener. Well, the garden was always where the pagan sacrifices were. That was always the place that was unholy. But that was where he was buried, and that's where he was risen. And in the Garden Grove or whatever. So Mary went the apostle to the apostles and told him, gave in all conviction that he was risen, fulfilling everything that had been promised, because it had been prophesied that through the prophets that there would be this great destruction, this judgment in the day of the Lord, and then all glory would be given to them, and then they would have the parallel that they had lost, paradise lost, the parallel being the garden of on earth and the garden in heaven, and that to inherit their role on earth is to not have God's presence except for them to be God's presence. So here Jesus is coming in God's presence, and with the judgment and everything that they had sworn by, they had sworn by the judgment. The Gentiles didn't swear by this judgment. And here they were guilty of it in all ways you could think of, even going back to Chronicles, who was biased as all get out, saying that, they didn't listen to any of the prophets, that they was rebellious and everything like that. And this is why they were judged, and this is why. So, then they rebuild and everything, and when they rebuild, they're not getting along with their neighbors. They're not finding the lost sheep. They're not including Samaria. They're not doing anything like that. They're not even having the presence in any kind of way. So after this all falls apart, and Daniel's 490 years is up, well, then it all changed on them. And it had been this appointed hour. Well, you go to John 2, and the Messianic secret and everything, it's not my hour, it's not my hour. Well, if you go into John 12:31, it says, now the judgment of the world, now the rule of the world will be cast out. Well, if you peep this right here in Ephesians 2:2, it says, where in time past ye walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that worketh in the children of disobedience. Well, the children of disobedience were those that were getting judged in 70 AD. This was before then. And so, as Paul said in Galatians 1:16, he prior times walked according to their ways, but he's got a new way, and he was teaching them all this. And so the power of the prince of the air, the son of perdition, Judas, is going to be cast out, and he burst asunder, and everything else, hung from a tree and all that. But he didn't receive the promise. But Peter, the rock that believed in him, he did receive this promise, and he didn't escape the sleep. He didn't escape any of that, but he still was given the keys to the kingdom and the power to judge the angels and the 12 tribes of Israel. And so that's all I have for today.